Thank you so much for joining the Oceanside Library this evening. I'd now love to introduce our educators from Cornell Cooperative Extension in Nassau County, Nicole and Beth, from Garden to Thanksgiving Table. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Okari, and thank you to Oceanside Library for having us today. My name is Nicole. I'm the Community Nutrition Educator here at CCE Nassau, and we're going to be flipping things a little bit differently than how we usually do them. Usually Beth does the first half where we talk about the garden and all sorts of good, all those good things we want to know about how to grow and harvest our veggies. But today we're swapping it. So I'm going to first do the recipe demonstration so I can get it in the oven, and then talk a little bit about the nutrition and the food, and then hand it over to Beth. So, all right, so usually we save the demo for the end, but again, I do want to get this in the oven. So making what you see down here, this is an image from Smitten Kitchen because I'm notoriously not great at taking pictures of my own, and I make this all the time. So it looks really fancy. It looks like something that took you hours and hours and hours, and it looks really special. But the reason I started making it is because it's a great way to use up either a bunch of sort of what seemingly random vegetables from your garden or the CSA, or even if you just have leftover roasted vegetables. So this is probably something I'm going to make for my Thanksgiving because I am a vegetarian. So I want something that's hearty and delicious and, full of all kinds of goodies without necessarily just being like a side of green beans and a salad, right? Because sometimes if you have a specific dietary restriction, you kind of get whatever's left over. So I wanted to highlight some of my favorite fall vegetables today, but you can really use this in whatever, use this as sort of an inspiration for what you like. But I have here today, I have some butternut squash. So again, you can roast this with the intention of making this, or roast a whole lot in the beginning of the week and just use what you have left up. I have some caramelized onions, some roasted Brussels sprouts. You could use sauteed greens. You could use, yams. You could use a whole bunch of different, veggies. I have some cannellini beans just to sort of up my protein, and a little bit of cheese. So this is optional. You don't have to do this. I have a little bit of sharp cheddar. It's not really going to make it cheesy. This isn't like a pizza. It's really just that sort of umami flavor. So you could use a little sprinkle of Parmesan or Fontina or Gruyere. Again, whatever you have on hand. And then my favorite herbs to use, if we're going to stick with that, savory Thanksgiving kind of flavor, I have some sage here. Rosemary or thyme would work really well. And if you do like red pepper flakes, salt and pepper, you can add other seasoning as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can start showing you what's in front of me. And I am using store-bought frozen pastry. So I'm making it something simple because it's a Monday night, right? So this makes it a little bit more accessible. Of course, you could make your own pastry. But again, I wanted something that was a little bit simpler and maybe not as ambitious for a weeknight. So
Nicole, I believe that we still are seeing your computer screen.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay. We want to see what you're doing.
Thank you. So you could probably use speaker view if you wanted to my screen to be the biggest. So again, I have my thawed pastry here. So as you can tell, I'm not necessarily looking for something that's vegan, raw, only vegetables. I'm staying away from all kinds of good stuff because I'm still highlighting plenty of, fresh vegetables, herbs, all that good stuff. So we're still getting the vitamins, minerals, fiber that you might not be getting from other dishes on the table, but we'll talk a little bit about that more about that later. So again, I have my squash. I'm going to add everything that I sort of mentioned before. So I got some onions. I have these Brussels sprouts. And sometimes I'll just make this filling, and whatever doesn't fit in the crust, I'll save for lunch the next day or something like that. So again, I have the sage. Probably use a little bit more sage than that, but that's okay. I'll scooch this over. Got that cheese. And again, it's not meant to make it a cheesy dish. It's really just to sort of bring out a little bit of umami and a little bit of that flavor. A little bit of, I probably won't even add salt either, because that cheese, if you're using Parmesan or something like that, you're going to get a little bit of that salt from the cheese. You can also, make this vegan. If you wanted to make a crust that didn't have any butter in it, if you wanted to leave out the cheese, you could also eliminate the egg wash. You could use like a flax egg instead. It's just to make that crust a little bit browner. All right. So again, this looks, I think, on the table as something that takes a lot of expertise and something super, elaborate. But again, we're just sort of filling, I would say, maybe till the outer 2 inches of that crust. It's pretty much going to take all this. So I probably had about 4 cups of combined vegetables altogether. So I'll spread it out a little bit. And then what you sort of want to do is just fold over the pastry over itself on the edges. So I start with like a little part, and then sometimes it rips, so I let that tell me where I'm going to fold next. So I'll fold it like this. And then again, I just keep going around that edge. And then I'll tuck it in and sort of fold it over. Fold it over a little bit more. And again, it looks like sort of a beautiful little veggie, pastry pocket. And then what I do like to do when it's done, I like to slice it in wedges. Sometimes I'll put like a fancy mustard or a balsamic glaze. I haven't made anything like this for Thanksgiving yet, but I imagine having it with leftover fresh cranberry sauce might be nice. So I currently have my oven set at 375. It'll take about 30 minutes in the oven, which would be perfect because by the time Beth and I are done talking, it'll be ready and I can show you the finished product. I think some people think that vegetarians have very bland, boring options or meals, so I like to make something that highlights the flavors and the different colors that you find in different vegetables, but also make it interesting. So again, I wasn't looking to just give you like a string beans almondine or something like that. This is something that might impress people. Maybe somebody who's not a vegetarian might appreciate it a little bit more. So I'm going to get this in the oven and I will be right back.
I know that I, for one, as a gardener, am always looking for something interesting to do with the vegetables that I grow. Because my children are always telling me, vegetables are boring. But then I go and I do programs with Nicole and they're really not. So that's always
Thanks. Yeah. Does anybody have any questions before I continue on?
I just have a comment that looked amazing. I can't wait to see that.
It is really
after
good.
baked. Yeah.
And like I said, I never make it the same way twice. I almost always have some sort of squash because I have it in my house this time of year, usually onions, but then I'm like, oh, what am I going to do with this Swiss chard? Or, oh, I got this, even cabbage from my CSA. So it sort of just lends itself to whatever you got around, which is nice for leftovers. That's not, like the turkey sandwich or something like that. You could even, I'm sure, put turkey in there and sort of make it a true, American traditional Thanksgiving sort of.
I was just going to say it could be a good leftover.
Yes, absolutely.
Dish.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's really cool.
All right. So again, we sort of did things a little bit backwards, but we're going to get into Thanksgiving now. Since we're in that month, it's sort of, we're in that season. But when we think about the Thanksgiving holiday that we know took root in the mid-19th centuries. And over the years, we've come to appreciate Thanksgiving as a way to celebrate our family's traditions or, the cultural traditions that we have, our connection to things like history and local foods. But if we think back to where Thanksgiving originated, what they called the harvest celebration, having just enough food was a reason enough to sort of designate a day to celebrate humility and to give thanks and gratitude. So simply sustaining was a big deal, right, back then. And determining what the colonists and the Native Americans may have eaten at that 17th century meal, right, or feast can sort of depend on the history. So in order to take an educated guess, we've studied, not me, but historians have studied things like cookbooks, maybe recipes that they've discovered, descriptions of the garden during that period, archaeological remains, maybe pollen samples that could give us a little bit of a clue as to what was growing or what was being eaten. And we know that there was a lot of influence from Mexico and South America because we had a lot of trade at the time, and also we see some cultural diffusion. So it is possible that they cooked wild turkey, but what I found is that it's more likely that goose or duck was the wildfowl of choice, potentially even swan or pigeons, which I don't know if we would think about doing now. But the way that they prepared them, typically they would boil them first and then roast them, or roast and then boil, because the roasting gives them a nicer flavor. It allows that caramelization to happen and make the broth darker. So especially if you had maybe a less favorable choice, doing things like roasting and cooking it a certain way can make things more palatable too. If the bird was stuffed, it wasn't exactly stuffed with what we have today, right? Bread stuffing. It was more likely onions and herbs, maybe chestnuts, to add that flavor to that bird. But because we suspect that, this first Thanksgiving was over, more than a day, maybe over those 3 days, they likely used the remains, over the next day or two, throw them in a pot, boil it up to make a broth. And they use that broth to make something called a pottage, which I had never heard of this term before, but that's essentially a soup or a stew. They also likely had access to eels and different types of shellfish like lobster, clams, mussels, and something like venison. So I don't know about you, I have never had eels or shellfish on my Thanksgiving table, even venison when I did eat meat. So I found that to be interesting. As far as the non-meats, so I think Beth and I both came to the similar conclusion that it was very meat focused. But besides that meat or the shellfish, the venison, we assume or we suppose that they had some sort of bread, not from wheat, but from maize, because that was what was abundant. Things like chestnuts, beech nuts, walnuts that they foraged from the forests. The three sisters, which Beth and I talked about in a different class. So that's corn, beans, and squash and pumpkin. And you'll see that it's pretty well balanced. Just, of course it's meat heavy, but you have all of these other, you have beautiful veggies and complex carbs coming from that corn, the beans, healthy fats coming from those nuts, tons of fiber, right? Think about that, lots and lots of fiber. But what you'll notice is that they didn't really have butter yet. They didn't have wheat flour to make things like pies and crusts and tarts that we think of. Even potatoes, white potatoes that came from South America and sweet potatoes from the Caribbean had not yet come to North America at this time. So things look a little bit different than they do today. So by the 1850s, most states and territories in the United States were celebrating some form of Thanksgiving. Lincoln made it a national holiday in 1863. And things that we come to recognize today, like turkey, sage dressing, creamed onions, turnips, mashed potatoes, were even exotic then. So they sort of came into popularity, and things have changed, right, from that first Thanksgiving to the mid 1800s, and of course from then to today. So now the foods that we associate with Thanksgiving, some of them are similar, right? Things like turkey, potatoes, pumpkin, pie, stuffing, cranberries. And in America today, we don't exactly have the problem of not enough, right? So we're not worried about sustaining ourselves. We have the opposite problem, abundance, too much. And in general, myself included, I associate this meal with things like excess, indulgence, right? It's kicking off the holidays, and it's essentially, 2 months of just eating right around the holiday time. So that just enough can have a value, if you keep that in the back of your mind. just to help you get through the holidays. What's interesting is that according to Consumer Reports, they found that Americans take in 3,000 to 4,500 calories at their Thanksgiving celebration. And if you have no concept of calories, depending on your age, weight, gender, et cetera, activity level, most adults need somewhere between 1,600 and 2,800 calories. So even if you're like a very, big guy, really active, that's still a lot for one meal, essentially, right? So if we think back to those staples, they're our staples, I should say. They're not exactly farm fresh or 100% seasonal. So when I think of my Thanksgivings growing up, there wasn't a lot of green. There was usually canned cranberry sauce. There's usually a lot of white potatoes, stuffing, bread, things like that. But there's a lot of super nutrient dense, delicious seasonal items that we can showcase during that meal. And so that number, those calories, the nutrient density of that meal will also depend on things like portion sizes, right? Second, third helpings, beverages. Alcoholic beverages are notorious for having sort of hidden calories, whether that's added sugars, right, in those mixed drinks and ciders. And so that all helps to add up to that 3,000, 4,000 calorie mark. But again, depends on what's on the table, who's cooking, right? Think about things like sweet potatoes and cranberries and cruciferous vegetables. They're nutrition heroes, right? So turkey, of course, we've seen has this historically significant place at the Thanksgiving table. And it's a source of lean protein. It has things like selenium, niacin, which is one of our B vitamins, pyroxidine, another B vitamin, phosphorus. So it has a lot of great things that can lend itself to a healthy meal. Cranberries, a ton of vitamin C, manganese, vitamin K, fiber. And so it's been called a superfood. I'll put that in quotes, superfood. And it's native to the Northeast, which is nice. Sweet potatoes, pumpkin, lots of things like vitamins A and C, manganese, copper, fiber, different B vitamins, iron, and of course our cruciferous vegetables, which are my favorite, I think, group. Things like Brussels sprouts and broccoli, cabbage have tons of carotenoids, which are known for being antioxidants, other things like vitamin C and vitamin K, folate, fiber. So there's a lot of potential to make your plate and make the dinner table much brighter and much more focused on these beautiful foods. So this is an interesting menu. It came from Consumer Reports, who did that estimation. It includes a full plate of dinner. It has red wine, some cornbread, and pumpkin pie. So keep in mind that, yes, it includes the main meal and the dessert, but in my house, appetizers are out all day. You get there at 1 o'clock and you're cooking. You got deviled eggs, you have cheese and crackers, you have some kind of dip, right? That's sort of stuff that you nosh on all day. So even at their sort of reduced calorie load, I'll say, it still has 1,753 calories, which again, if you think back to what an adult needs, is still a lot for one meal. But the plate does resemble my plate if you've never seen that before. So about half the plate looks like fruits and vegetables. So we have some green beans, cranberries, maybe some yams. And it's also interesting to note that they give you the portion size and the corresponding calories, because I know when you take that scoop of mashed potatoes, you're not thinking in your head, and I don't either. As a dietitian, I do not think, all right, that scoop of mashed potatoes is 237 calories. I don't do it. I don't weigh my food, right? But I like to follow my plate, and that gives you an idea of portions. But things like pie, special desserts, cookies, they're hard to estimate and they're hard to limit, especially if it's your favorite. So again, I'm not asking you to calorie count on Thanksgiving, but it's just nice to have it in the back of your mind. This is another plate. And again, you can see that even more so than the first plate, there's a ton of vegetables, a ton. I mean, we have a salad on the side, you have your plate, which has, again, some yams, some Brussels sprouts, string beans, what looks like a tiny bit of mashed potatoes, right? And a piece of turkey. So my palm is about 3 ounces, and that's generally an appropriate serving size for something like turkey or another protein. But again, it's not necessarily about counting calories, but just being mindful about what's on your plate. But it's definitely not as bland in color or flavor as I think even some of my historic plates over the years. I love mashed potatoes. I love stuffing. As a vegetarian, that's probably what I mostly ate, for a while. So how can we make the meal more healthful without completely raining on your parade, right? Yes, I'm a dietitian, but I also really love food, which is why, using pie crust as part of my meal, I'm not concerned about it. I'm not, oh my goodness, but what about, I'm going to enjoy it. And I know that I'm getting a ton of vegetables in there. So that's happy. That makes me happy. So that brings me to the fourth bullet. Bring something you like. So if you have a certain dietary pattern, like me, I'm a vegetarian. If you have a food allergy, if you have a certain therapeutic diet, so say you have diabetes or heart disease, you want to enjoy the day without feeling stressed about the meal and what you're going to eat. So at least if you bring something that you love, that fits in, you have something to rely on. Because I do find that a lot, that when I go places, even a barbecue, I'll have to bring my veggie burger. I'll have to bring sort of a side dish that I know that I'll want to eat. All right, so starting at the top. So prepare what you need. Leftovers are great. Thanksgiving is notorious for leftovers, but think about the menu, how much you're making. Do you really need a 12-pound turkey, or could you get away with a 3-pound turkey breast? Do you need 3 types of pie, or can you agree on 1? Making ingredient swaps only when it won't affect the final product, I'll say. Trying to make some like crazy vegan dessert might not satisfy you. So something like low sodium broth or using low fat dairy might help you sort of cut down on calories, and you won't even notice the difference in flavor. Again, making half your plate fruits and vegetables, and include your true fall favorites. So you don't necessarily need to fill up on Oreos. If someone puts a plate of Oreos out for dessert, or cheese and crackers, like something you can get all year round. But if your aunt makes a famous pumpkin pie, or if your cousin makes some, like crazy special dip and you only see them once a year, I would absolutely dig into that. And again, COVID things might be a little different this year. But the point is to concentrate on those things that you don't really have all the time, or you don't have access to, or don't get the chance to experience. You can also donate food afterwards, canned and boxed. I don't think most places will accept cooked, but keep that in mind if you have leftover canned or boxed goods. All right. So a few mindful eating tips. Be mindful throughout the day. Did you have a ton of, again, cheese and crackers, and now you're already full, right? You're not even hungry for turkey. So a few things to consider would be to focus before eating. So take a few deep breaths just before you decide what to eat. How do you feel? Are you hungry? Are you anxious? Are you stressed out because, your mother-in-law, or whatever it is? Because we eat for reasons other than hunger. So maybe you're stressed out. So just check in with yourself a little bit. Sit down when you eat. That can be tough for those of us cooking, or, when you have hors d'oeuvres and they're just sort of out continuously and you're just walking around with the plate, because you sort of forget what you ate. You're walking around, you're talking to people, and you forget. So if you sit down, if you slow down and you sort of pay attention, you'll be more present. Eat until you feel satisfied. So eat when you're physically hungry and pay attention. So this especially happens with things like dessert, something that's really decadent. You take the first bite and it is unbelievable. And then you keep eating and it's sort of, at some point it stops tasting as good. So think about that. When did it not taste as good as that first bite? Or when did your hunger go away? When did you feel like you could stop and be satisfied? And that leads us to, the last bullet. So if you're checking in on your hunger and fullness before, during, and after the meal, you'll have a better idea, of how you're feeling, so you don't go completely overboard. Because, the example I use during the year is, are you at 10? Are you uncomfortably sick? Are you at Thanksgiving unbuttoning your pants? So we don't want to be there. So 0 being empty and starving, and that 10 being uncomfortable, physically sick, that 3 to 7 is a nice place to be, right? You're kind of neutral. You're either like, I could eat, or I'm pretty full. So you don't want to be at the very low or very high ends. So if you start eating when you're lightly and moderately hungry, and you're more likely to stop eating when you're lightly or moderately full. If you start eating when you're absolutely starving, you're more likely to experience sort of a loss of control or potentially eat until you're stuffed or feeling sick. So the answer isn't to skip breakfast and lunch, right? I'm gonna fast for the day before, and then I'm gonna skip breakfast and lunch so I can go all out for the meal. Our bodies don't really like that. So keep that in mind, and you wanna pace yourself. I know it sounds silly, but that also just means checking in and seeing how you feel physically and emotionally throughout the day. So here we have our galette, which is in the oven. So I'm gonna stop sharing and toss it over to Beth unless we have any questions for me beforehand. I hope I didn't go too fast.
Okay, and so basically picking up from there, my usual approach in these presentations that we do together is usually to talk about growing a particular vegetable, or in the case of the three sisters, 3 particular vegetables. But Thanksgiving really includes so many different things in it that would be foolish. So I'm going to instead think about how Thanksgiving and your garden are both meaningful to you and are both connecting you in the same ways. Thanksgiving is a feast, and it is definitely healthier to slow down, be mindful, and truly enjoy it instead of feeling sick afterwards and worrying and feeling guilty because you ate too much, as Nicole said. Every culture has, the celebration of a feast that celebrates abundance, which, as Nicole pointed out, for us, abundance means just a glut of stuff. But for people throughout most of the rest of history, abundance meant you had enough. And that was really good. And so that's in all kinds of different cultures. And oh boy, am I sharing my screen properly?
You are sharing it. It's just
Oh,
not
no,
in presentation
there we go. I just
mode.
need to do the full presentation.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. Those feasts were very frequently tied to a celebration of harvest. Up until very recently, people were really tied closely to the rhythms of the natural seasons and the rhythms of land and of nature, and especially agrarian societies. You worked very, very hard on getting that food to grow. And, it was worthwhile work and it was fulfilling work and people accepted it, but it was still a lot of work, and it did culminate in the fall. You gathered in everything that had come to fruition and you said, wow, we have enough, let's celebrate. But it was very closely tied to the calendar year and to the rhythm of the seasons. And in that first Thanksgiving, the one we take as our model for the first Thanksgiving, especially the one at Plymouth, after the first year of living there, that meal had many, many layers of meaningfulness for the people there. It wasn't just a successful harvest, although it was definitely that. Fully half the colonists had died the previous winter. So there were only about 50 of them at the feast, and about 90 Native Americans who had, after that first terrible winter, had helped them throughout the year to learn to grow certain things, to start to understand this new land, this new ecosystem, what grows, what's running around that you can eat. So they had made it. They had lost a lot of people, but then this year things were getting better and they were gonna survive. And whatever attitudes became later between colonists and Native Americans, in that meal, there was community. These people sat down with each other, 90 Native Americans and 50 white colonists, for a meal and celebrations for 3 days. And I think there was a lot of gratitude, and there was a lot of sense that we are different people coming together. And whether that fell apart afterwards or not, I don't know. But for that moment in time, there was that sense of community and family and the preciousness of life. And also abundance from that particular land. They had made it through by growing the corn and possibly also the beans and squash that the Native Americans had showed them how to grow, and by living off of the things that grew and that lived in that land So they were connecting to this new locality, this new place. They were also, however, incorporating tastes from their home. They brought seeds with them, and this meal was probably supplemented with some things they brought with them. Maybe they brought some seeds and grew some sage or parsley, onions, leeks, peas, things like that, that they brought from Europe. And the way in which they prepared the meal was hearkening back to what they were used to. They hadn't even constructed an oven, so they couldn't make bread the traditional way, but they still, tried to prepare things in a way that made sense to them, a way that harkened back to the way they knew how to cook. So they were using these new foods in this new place, but taking their own background and connecting to that. And that's something that we can all do in our own Thanksgiving celebrations. And I'll talk mostly about how you can carry that into the garden. But this meal, this is this very iconic Thanksgiving image by Norman Rockwell. And this is what we think of when we think of Thanksgiving. But the title of this picture is not Thanksgiving. This is part of a series that he did on American freedoms. This one is called Freedom from Want. So, he had freedom of speech, freedom of religion, many other lovely paintings in this series. But this is very symbolic and iconic. And again, it's not about a glut and overabundance. It's about freedom from want, freedom from need. We have enough. And in this image, it captures the fact that it's really about connecting to home and family. And for us, like those early colonists, we can also connect to our own local ecology and to our local community, our local food system. This is Rockwell's painting that he titled Thanksgiving. And he recognized that the essence of this meal is family, is home. And so all the more reason to, as Nicole said, put the things you like on the table and go ahead and harken back to whatever cultural tradition that you have, unless you really want to do, a historical Thanksgiving, and then you're going to have to go find things like venison and, eels. Good luck and have fun. But most of us, we really just want to be able to celebrate in a way that's very comfortable and that makes us think about home. And I will talk about how satisfying it is to grow it yourself on your own land if you have that capability. If you're in an apartment, that's a little tricky. But if you have space, growing things and incorporating them not just into the Thanksgiving meal, but into your meals throughout the year provides you with a real connection to who you are and where you are. So yeah, on the table, put the stuff people love and don't put the stuff that nobody likes, because that's just silly. So if that can of cranberry sauce is still there at the end of the meal every Thanksgiving, stop putting it on the table. The ravioli is there because when I first met my husband, he had just had Thanksgiving with his parents and they spent the day making homemade turkey ravioli because they're Italian. His parents are children of Italian immigrants and they wanted a pasta course. And they were very, very patriotic, very proud of being Americans, but they were also very deeply Italian and you were supposed to have a pasta course. So there's nothing wrong with that. Put it on the table. If you are from India or Korea or Italy, a feast will look maybe a little different to you than it does in that iconic Norman Rockwell picture. And that's fine because this meal really is about connecting to yourself and your family. If you have the capability to grow food at home, there are tons of good reasons to do it. And of course, there's the usual environmental impact thing. You do, really make a difference when you grow your own food environmentally, but most of the good reasons to grow your own food are about you and they're about your enjoyment. It's entertaining, it's fun, it's relaxing. You will learn things. It's mentally stimulating to learn how to garden, especially if you can let go of the idea you have to do it perfectly the first time. No, learn, have fun. The plant dies, put another one in. It's very healthy for you. Every time I go to the doctor, I'm told my vitamin D levels are better than anybody else she sees because I go outside in the sun. You're moving around and your senses are more deeply involved in gardening than in almost any other activity. Both your sense of touch and your sense of smell We don't use those senses a great deal, but both of them have very deep connections to our emotions, to our memories. So gardening really, really connects you with your body using senses that you don't normally use. And it's so satisfying. Something as humble as a bowl of lettuce leaves. It's a salad that you grew, but it's so satisfying. You can be so proud of it when you put it on the table. I love putting my own salad on the table. It makes me happy. So that's really the best reason to garden that I can think of, and to grow your own food. And if you want to think about Thanksgiving when you're thinking about planting your garden at home, then that's great. But I would say don't try to plan the entire feast in one garden. That can be very tricky. Start small. Pick something that you really like and learn about it. So you can pick one thing that's very manageable. I have a son who the only vegetable he wants to eat is carrots. Okay, so I'll plant carrots. I'll plant carrots several times during the season, and then I will have them on the Thanksgiving table. If you really, really want to have the experience of growing that pumpkin for the pie, go ahead, learn how to grow a pumpkin. Flavorings. Herbs are some of the easiest things to grow frequently. Sage is one of the plants that I touch least in my garden, and I absolutely love it in stuffing and with all kinds of fowl game birds. Also, if you grow things yourself, you have an opportunity to really just have your favorites around all the time, even things that are from different cultures. Now, you're going to have a kind of a hard time if you grew up in a place where there were 4 or 5 different kinds of bananas available commonly. That's a bit of a stretch as far as providing your own cultural connections. Bananas are big. But I grow lemongrass, turmeric, and ginger in pots in my house. They're currently in my kitchen in the window. And if you try to grow yourself from seed, all kinds of things are available to you. That beautiful little purple tomatillo on the end, I found that in several different seed catalogs. If you are bold enough to grow from seed, you can grow just the broadest variety you can imagine. If you're a hot pepper fanatic, you're going to go crazy with all the different varieties that are available to you if you grow from seed. You can even find ethnic specialty catalogs. This Kitazawa Seed Company in the middle has tons of Asian varieties of plants that I didn't know were out there. And I had a lot of fun growing several of them. So be bold, try things. Seeds are cheap. And if they don't grow right, so what? You didn't spend that much money on them. And planning a garden, depending on how much space you have, just say, okay, this is the thing that I want to have for Thanksgiving. It's the sage for the stuffing. Where am I going to put it? It's really nice over the winter to have this little planning activity, and not just for a Thanksgiving garden, for your garden, a garden that's going to feed you. Take your time after Thanksgiving. Think about it. Say, what would I have liked to have grown? And then sit down and start thinking, where can I put that outside? If you are intimidated by the idea of trying to figure out, well, a zucchini is going to be this big, but basil's only this big, and how many can I fit here? If that makes you anxious, go ahead and use an online garden planner. There are several that are free. There are a couple that are really good that are cheap. I like to draw on graph paper just because that's how I think. I scribble on paper. But a lot of people love the online planners. It'll tell you this is how much space you need for this plant, and this is how much space you need for this one. This is how long this one takes to ripen, which is something you will have to learn when you pick what you want to grow for yourself. And it will really help you plan out your garden year. So the other aspect of that Thanksgiving was the connection to the here and now, this land, here, now. And we actually live in a place that's very, very similar to the Plymouth Plantation. The whole Northeast shares a very similar ecosystem and a lot of the same plants. And the Native Americans, of course, like any people who have lived somewhere for thousands of years, had a widely varied diet, because even in terms of vegetables, because there's just so many different plants, and they figured out all of the ones that could give them something. So there are cultivated plants, corn, beans, and squash. That's the traditional Three Sisters. Those were their staples, and that's what they shared with those early settlers. that these are the things that you can grow that are going to really give you the nutrition that you need, and they're all winter storable. And those are all things that you can grow in your garden if you have enough space. If you don't have a lot of space, I'd recommend just starting with beans because you can grow them vertically. Pumpkins and corn are both going to take a lot of room, but they're fun. They're really fun to grow. There are also plants that just grow wild that didn't have to be planted every year. They're not annuals. The Northeast has all kinds of different perennial plants that are edible. This is just a sampling of them down here. And here's a list. The cultivated were obviously the pumpkins and squash, corn and beans. Frequently sunflowers were planted with the Three Sisters garden. They were another annual, and they were used for their high nutritional value in their oil. But also you could forage in the wild and find all kinds of berries, fruits, nuts, tubers, greens, flavorings. It's a very extensive list of different plants that grow here naturally and that are really very, very good to eat. If you are thinking, oh, well, I'll just go out and forage in the wild and pick what those early settlers ate, that's great, but you need to know a few things. First of all, you need to make sure the plant you're looking for is not endangered because collecting it would be illegal. You also need to know how to identify plants correctly. You need to be 100% sure when you pick something out of a forest exactly what it is. Now, plants produce chemicals. That's how they protect themselves. And many of them don't do a thing to us. Some of them are very healthy for us. Some of them will make us rather sick. Some of them will make us very ill, and a very few will kill us. So you really need to know for sure what your plant is before you pick it. And you have to know how to prepare it. Not every plant can be eaten raw. And you need to make sure if you're collecting from the wild, you don't collect from the side of the road. You might as well lick a car tailpipe. That's gross. And don't collect from an industrial site. The place you're collecting from should be clean. Even if there seems like there's a lot there, don't take it all. Don't over-collect, leave some plants to regenerate. And you can also consider taking a class with a trained forager, or an experienced forager, I should say, because I don't think there is an existing certification for a forager. You're basically relying on someone with a lot of experience and a lot of skill, but they don't have a certificate that says, I know this. So you're probably okay, because if they were really bad at it, they would probably be dead. But you got to know this is not an official title or position. So really a better option is to grow some of these native plants in your own yard. Some of them are very beautiful. Blueberries, elderberries, serviceberries, beach plums, those are the ones that I show on the bottom there. They're all shrubs. They are all very, very low maintenance. They all have lovely flowers and edible fruit. When you buy these things, make sure you're buying from a nursery that sounds like they know what they're talking about. A few places will include plants they say are natives just so they can kind of satisfy the people who say, we want native plants. And they say, oh yeah, fine, we have one over here. Go with somebody who's interested in the subject and who seems to really know what they're doing. And if you're going to do, what they call edible landscaping, choose something low maintenance first. So these shrubs that I listed below are not a lot of work, but say a wild grape is going to require a lot of pruning and a lot of care. So, I mean, if you want to get fruit out of it, if you just want it to cover up everything in your garden, you can let it alone. But choose things where you don't have to take a lot of trouble for them. Which, if you're curious, that can lead you into the really beautiful and I think fascinating world of edible landscaping. These are both from gardens designed by a woman named Rosalind Creasy, who's really regarded as kind of the authority in this area. And you can have food in your yard that is beautiful and that incorporates into your landscape. So don't forget that. That's another way to connect to your yard, is to make it both beautiful and edible. But that's another subject for another day. If you don't have enough space or enough sun to grow your own food, you can still connect to place. And you can connect by basically supporting the community of people who do produce food around you. So support local agriculture. Join a CSA during the year. This is going to reduce your carbon footprint. You will enjoy fresher food because it's local, and because it is locally produced, you are also still connecting to place. The things that you buy through a cooperative or from Taste New York or from, a local farm, these things were produced by the land around you. And even if they're, food products, preserves, or sausages or whatever, they were made by your community. And they are still connecting you in that way to the land and to your neighbors. So that's about all I have to say about designing your garden to sort of fit in with Thanksgiving, but it's really a way of finding that Thanksgiving connection throughout the year, which you can do in your yard.
That was great.
All right. So should we take questions while we wait for?
We could take questions. I can also show
Yeah.
you the finished.
Oh, it's out.
It's out.
Oh!
So when I eat them, I cut it into slices. You will have to eat it with a fork and a knife. It's not sort of like a pizza pie. But again, now I'm gonna, of course, the first piece, it's still hot, right? So it's very hot. But I like to eat it with either Trader Joe's. I don't get any money from Trader Joe's, but it's a Trader Joe's seasonal mustard that they have, or like a balsamic dressing, or again, cranberry sauce, or even gravy. I could see, from your Thanksgiving table being really nice on this. But yes, ready for questions.
Thank you. So again, you can write questions in the chat, or I will give participants, you are allowed to unmute yourself if you have a question and you want to speak instead of write it out. But thank you so much to both of you. The presentation was so nice. I really enjoyed a little history lesson too. And the food, of course, is always amazing. Nicole always makes really cool dishes. So yeah, does anyone have any questions? All right, let me end the recording here just in case.